The night was oppressive, cloaking the city in a heavy silence as I stepped into the dimly lit lobby of my apartment building, the flickering fluorescent lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. My day had been exhausting, and I longed for the solace of my apartment, but the elevator was acting up again. As I pressed the button and waited, the distant hum of the old elevator machinery was the only sound breaking the stillness. When the elevator finally arrived with a groan, its doors slid open to reveal a dimly lit interior. I hesitated for a moment, but fatigue pushed me forward, and I stepped inside. The doors closed behind me with a soft, metallic thud, and I pressed the button for my floor. The elevator jolted and began its ascent, but something felt off. The usual creaks and groans seemed louder, more insistent. I glanced at the small, flickering light above the door, and a shiver ran down my spine as it dimmed intermittently. The small, mirrored panel on the wall seemed to warp and distort my reflection, making me look gaunt and hollow-eyed. As the elevator continued its climb, I noticed a faint, almost imperceptible vibration beneath my feet. It was as if the elevator had started to sway slightly, unsettling and disorienting. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. I reached for the emergency button, but it was missing, a dark void where it should have been. The elevator shuddered violently, and the lights flickered out completely, plunging me into darkness. My heart pounded in my chest, and I fumbled for my phone to use its flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the old, scratched walls of the elevator. In the dim glow, I noticed something horrifying. Scrawled in faded, blood-red paint were the words, "Not alone." A sudden, bone-chilling coldness filled the space, and I heard a soft whispering, like voices carried on the wind. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the elevator's interior, but there was nothing there. Panic surged through me as the whispering grew louder, becoming a cacophony of agonized cries and mournful wails. The elevator jerked to a stop, and the doors creaked open. I was met with a scene of utter desolation, a hallway bathed in a sickly green light, lined with peeling wallpaper and broken tiles. The air was thick with the stench of mildew and decay. I stared in horror as the walls seemed to close in, the hallway stretching endlessly into the darkness. Summoning all my courage, I stepped out of the elevator, but as soon as my foot touched the ground, the elevator doors slammed shut behind me. I tried to force them open, but they wouldn't budge. The elevator began its descent again, the sound of its machinery fading into the distance. With a sense of dread settling over me, I turned to face the hallway. I had no choice but to move forward, the whispering voices growing louder with each step. The corridor seemed to shift and twist, the green light casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. My breaths came in ragged gasps as I stumbled through the corridor, the feeling of being watched pressing down on me. Suddenly, I found myself in a small room, its walls lined with faded photographs and old, dusty furniture. At the center of the room was an old, ornate mirror, its surface covered in a thick layer of grime. I approached it cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I wiped away the grime, my reflection appeared, but it wasn't quite right. My reflection seemed to move independently, its eyes hollow and dark. A cold, bony hand gripped my shoulder, and I spun around to face an apparition, a gaunt figure with hollow eyes and a mournful expression. The figure reached out, its fingers brushing against my skin, and I felt an icy chill seep into my bones. With a sudden, desperate burst of strength, I tore away from the apparition and raced back down the corridor. The whispering voices grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the walls closing in on me. I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, until I reached the elevator. I pounded on the doors, screaming for them to open, and finally, they slid open with a groan. I stumbled inside, my heart racing, and pressed the button for the ground floor. The elevator began its ascent, the familiar hum of the machinery returning. As the doors opened, I stepped into the lobby, the oppressive air of the haunted hallway now behind me. I looked back at the elevator as the doors slid shut, the chilling feeling of dread still lingering. I knew I would never take that elevator again, and as I made my way to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me from the shadows. The late hour had rendered the cityscape a sprawling mosaic of distant lights and silent streets. The street lamps outside my apartment building cast long, wavering shadows that seemed to stretch and sway with the rhythm of the night breeze. I had just returned from a grueling shift at work, my fatigue weighing heavily on my shoulders. The thought of collapsing into my bed was the only thing that kept me moving as I approached the old, weathered building. The lobby of the building was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards beneath my feet. The air was thick with the musty scent of age and neglect. The building itself was a relic from a bygone era, its once grand interior now marred by years of wear and tear. The elevator, a clunky, outdated contraption that had seen better days, awaited me in the corner of the lobby. I pressed the call button, and the elevator responded with its usual groan, a sound that seemed to come from deep within its rusty mechanisms. The doors opened with a reluctant shudder, revealing the dimly lit interior. I stepped inside, the space illuminated only by a flickering overhead light that seemed to struggle to stay on. The elevator was small and cramped, its mirrored walls reflecting a distorted version of myself back at me. The moment the doors closed behind me, I felt an odd sensation of confinement, as if the walls were slowly closing in. I pressed the button for my floor, and the elevator jolted into motion with a mechanical clank. The ascent was slow, and the familiar creaks and groans of the elevator seemed louder than usual tonight. The air inside grew colder, causing my breath to mist in front of me. As the elevator continued its climb, the lights above flickered more erratically, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I glanced at the small display showing the floor number. It was stuck on the same number, despite the elevator's steady ascent. A cold sweat began to form on my brow, and I felt an inexplicable sense of dread. Without warning, the elevator shuddered violently, and the lights went out completely, plunging me into an oppressive darkness. My heartbeat quickened as I fumbled for my phone, its flashlight cutting through the gloom. The beam of light revealed the cramped interior of the elevator, the mirrors now reflecting nothing but shadows. My anxiety escalated as I noticed something unsettling. The small, etched words, "Help me," were barely visible on one of the mirrored walls, as if someone had scratched them in desperation. My pulse raced, and I reached for the emergency button, only to find that it was missing, leaving behind a dark void where it should have been. Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the elevator, and I could see my breath forming clouds in the air. The whispering began, soft at first, like distant voices carried on the wind. It was almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second. The voices were indistinguishable, a cacophony of sorrowful cries and mournful wails. I pressed the button for the ground floor repeatedly, but the elevator did not respond. The whispering voices continued to grow louder, merging into a dissonant chorus of anguish. My flashlight revealed the elevator's interior in stark relief. The walls seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, the shadows moving as if alive. The elevator jerked to a halt, and the doors creaked open. I hesitated for a moment before stepping out into the dimly lit corridor beyond. The hallway was bathed in a sickly green light, the source of which was indiscernible. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper and broken tiles, creating a sense of desolation and decay. The air was thick with the stench of mildew and rot. As I ventured further down the hallway, the temperature dropped significantly, and my breath came out in visible puffs. The whispering voices grew louder, more insistent, and I could hear them forming fragmented sentences, though their meaning was lost in the chaotic noise. I quickened my pace, the oppressive atmosphere weighing heavily on my shoulders. I reached a small room, its door slightly ajar. Inside, the room was filled with old, dusty furniture and faded photographs that lined the walls. At the center of the room stood an ornate mirror, its surface covered in a thick layer of grime. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I approached the mirror and began to clean away the grime with my sleeve. As the mirror's surface became clearer, my reflection emerged, but it was not quite right. My reflection looked gaunt and hollow-eyed, its expression one of deep sorrow. I stared in horror as my reflection's eyes moved independently, locking onto me with an unsettling intensity. A cold, bony hand suddenly grasped my shoulder, and I spun around to face an apparition, a gaunt figure with hollow eyes and a mournful expression. The figure's presence was suffused with an overwhelming sense of despair. Its eyes seemed to penetrate my very soul, conveying an unspoken plea for help. The apparition's fingers brushed against my skin, and an icy chill seeped into my bones. My fear surged, and I tore away from the apparition, racing back down the corridor. The whispering voices had become a deafening roar, and the walls seemed to close in on me, their surfaces undulating as if alive. I stumbled back to the elevator, my heart pounding in my chest. The doors were partially open, and I hurled myself inside, desperately pressing the button for the ground floor. The elevator began its descent, the familiar hum of the machinery returning. As the elevator moved, I could hear the voices fading, but the oppressive atmosphere lingered. When the elevator doors finally opened, I was back in the lobby, the normalcy of the surroundings a stark contrast to the horrors I had just experienced. I stumbled out, glancing back at the elevator with a mix of fear and relief. The sense of dread that had clung to me was slowly dissipating, but I knew that I would never be able to shake the feeling of that night. With a final, lingering glance at the elevator, I made my way to my apartment. The haunting whispers and the chilling presence of the apparition would stay with me, a reminder of the night I had encountered something truly otherworldly. The city outside my apartment window was a patchwork of lights and shadows, the streets below bathed in the faint, amber glow of streetlights. The evening had slipped into night, and with it came an unsettling quiet. It was the kind of stillness that pressed on the ears and made even the hum of distant traffic feel intrusive. I had just finished a long day at work and was exhausted, yearning for nothing more than the comfort of my bed. As I entered the lobby of my old apartment building, I felt an almost palpable relief at being home. The lobby was a relic from an era long past, with its dark, polished marble floors and antique wooden paneling that spoke of better days. The grand chandelier hanging from the ceiling was dim, its crystals catching the little light that remained. The building was a historical landmark, and while its age added to its charm, it also brought with it an aura of decay and neglect. I pressed the call button for the elevator and waited, my gaze drifting to the ornate clock on the wall that ticked away the seconds with a measured rhythm. The elevator's arrival was announced by a deep, metallic groan that resonated through the building. When the doors finally slid open, I stepped inside, the interior lit by a single flickering bulb that swung from the ceiling like a pendulum. The elevator was small and claustrophobic, with mirrors lining the walls that made the space seem even more cramped. The lights above the mirrors flickered erratically, casting strange, dancing shadows on the polished floor. I pressed the button for my floor, and the elevator jolted into motion with a shudder. As it began its ascent, I could feel the old machinery straining, each creak and groan sending a shiver down my spine. The elevator's motion was erratic, and the familiar sounds of its operation seemed to grow louder and more unsettling. The air inside grew cold, and I noticed my breath forming little clouds in the dim light. I glanced at the small digital display that indicated the current floor number, and to my growing unease, it was stuck on the number of the floor I had just left. I pressed the button for my floor again, but the elevator did not respond. A sense of dread began to creep over me, a feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. The lights flickered more violently, and I felt a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature. The elevator seemed to slow to a crawl, and the shadows cast by the flickering lights grew elongated and distorted. Without warning, the lights went out entirely, plunging me into darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, its flashlight casting a weak beam that barely cut through the blackness. In the narrow light, I saw that the mirrored walls of the elevator now reflected an unsettlingly distorted version of myself. My reflection seemed to move independently, its expression twisted into one of terror. The elevator shuddered again, and I could hear a faint, rhythmic banging from somewhere within the walls. I tried to press the emergency button, but it was missing, leaving only an empty space where it should have been. Panic surged through me, and I pounded on the elevator doors, shouting for help, but my cries were swallowed by the oppressive silence. The whispering began, barely audible at first, like distant voices murmuring in an unknown language. It grew louder and more insistent, a dissonant chorus of sorrowful voices that seemed to echo from all around me. I turned in circles, the flashlight revealing nothing but the claustrophobic confines of the elevator. The elevator lurched to a stop, and the doors creaked open, revealing a dimly lit corridor beyond. I hesitated, my fear clashing with the desire to escape the oppressive confines of the elevator. The corridor stretched out before me, bathed in a sickly green light that seemed to emanate from nowhere. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floor was littered with debris. As I stepped out into the corridor, a cold draft swept through the space, making the air feel like ice. The whispering voices grew louder, more coherent, though I could not make out the words. They seemed to follow me, growing louder with each step I took. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, the green light casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. I reached a small room off to the side, its door slightly ajar. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was filled with old, dusty furniture and faded photographs that lined the walls. At the center of the room stood an antique mirror, its surface covered in a thick layer of grime. I approached the mirror, my flashlight revealing its tarnished frame and grimy surface. I wiped away the grime with my sleeve, revealing my reflection. But as the mirror cleared, my reflection was not quite right. It seemed to be alive, its eyes hollow and dark, its expression one of deep, unsettling sadness. A cold, spectral hand suddenly reached out from the mirror and grasped my shoulder. I spun around to face a ghostly apparition, a gaunt figure with hollow eyes and a mournful expression. The figure's presence was suffused with an overwhelming sense of despair, its gaze penetrating my very soul. The apparition's fingers brushed against my skin, sending an icy chill through my body. I staggered back, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The whispering voices had become a cacophony of anguished cries, and the walls seemed to close in on me, their surfaces undulating and shifting. I fled from the room, racing back down the corridor with a sense of frantic urgency. The whispers grew louder, a relentless cacophony of torment that seemed to follow me. I reached the elevator, but the doors were shut tight. I pounded on them, desperate to escape the nightmare that had engulfed me. In a final, desperate act, I pressed the call button repeatedly, my heart pounding in my chest. The elevator doors creaked open, and I threw myself inside, my breath coming in desperate gasps. I pressed the button for the ground floor, and the elevator began its descent, the familiar hum of the machinery returning. As the elevator moved downward, the whispering voices gradually faded, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. When the doors finally opened, I was back in the lobby, the normalcy of the surroundings a stark contrast to the horrors I had just experienced. I stumbled out, my legs feeling weak and unsteady. I glanced back at the elevator one last time, the sense of dread lingering in my mind. I knew that I would never take that elevator again, and the haunting whispers and ghostly apparition would remain with me, a chilling reminder of the night I had faced something truly otherworldly. It was late September when the weather began to change, and with it came a chilling wind that seemed to seep into every crevice of my apartment building. I had just finished an unusually taxing day at work, my mind reeling from the constant barrage of deadlines and demands. As I stepped into the lobby of my old apartment building, I was greeted by the familiar sight of its aging grandeur, a relic of a time when buildings were constructed with pride and craftsmanship. The lobby's once opulent decor now showed signs of neglect. The marble floors were scuffed and worn, the walls adorned with tarnished, ornate moldings. The chandelier that hung from the ceiling flickered with a weak, yellow light, casting distorted shadows across the room. The elevator, a bulky metal box with intricate engravings, stood in the corner, its presence a constant reminder of the building's history. I pressed the button to call the elevator and waited, glancing at the clock on the wall that ticked with an almost rhythmic insistence. The elevator arrived with a groan, its doors sliding open with a slow, deliberate motion. I stepped inside, the space lit by a single, flickering bulb that cast an eerie glow on the metal walls. The mirrors lining the elevator reflected my tired, drawn face, adding to the feeling of confinement. As the elevator began its ascent, I pressed the button for my floor. The usual creaks and groans of the machinery felt amplified tonight, as though the elevator were protesting its own existence. The air inside grew cooler, and I noticed my breath misting in the dim light. I glanced at the small display indicating the floor number and saw that it was stuck on the number of the floor I had just left. A sense of unease settled over me. The elevator jolted suddenly, and the lights flickered violently before going out entirely. The darkness was absolute, pressing in on me from all sides. I fumbled for my phone, its flashlight revealing the cramped interior of the elevator. The mirrors reflected nothing but shadows, and a sense of dread began to creep over me. As I tried to press the emergency button, I found it was missing. The space where it should have been was just an empty void. My heartbeat quickened, and I started to feel the oppressive weight of the silence. The only sound was the occasional, unsettling clank from the elevator's machinery, as if something were moving within its walls. Then came the whispering. At first, it was barely audible, like the distant murmur of wind. But as the seconds passed, the whispers grew louder, coalescing into a dissonant symphony of voices. They seemed to be coming from all directions, their words unintelligible but filled with a sense of desperate urgency. I tried to force the elevator doors open, but they wouldn't budge. The whispering voices continued to grow louder, their intensity rising. The elevator began to sway slightly, as though it were being rocked by an unseen force. My flashlight flickered and dimmed, casting erratic beams of light that danced across the mirrored walls. The elevator suddenly stopped with a jolt, and the doors creaked open. I hesitated, peering into the dimly lit corridor beyond. The hallway was bathed in a sickly green light, its source hidden from view. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floor was littered with debris. A cold draft swept through the corridor, making the air feel icy. As I stepped out of the elevator, the whispering voices grew louder, more coherent. They seemed to be pleading, their tones filled with a sense of anguish. I made my way down the corridor, the green light casting eerie shadows that shifted and swayed. The air was thick with the stench of mildew and decay. I reached a door slightly ajar and pushed it open. Inside was a small room, filled with old, dusty furniture and faded photographs. The walls were lined with shelves holding forgotten trinkets and knickknacks. In the center of the room stood an old, ornate mirror, its surface obscured by a thick layer of grime. I approached the mirror, driven by a mix of curiosity and fear. As I wiped away the grime with my sleeve, my reflection slowly emerged. But the reflection was not quite right. It seemed to be moving independently, its eyes dark and hollow, its expression twisted into one of deep sorrow. Before I could react, a cold, spectral hand reached out from the mirror and grasped my shoulder. I spun around to face a ghostly apparition, a gaunt figure with hollow eyes and a mournful expression. The figure's presence was suffused with an overwhelming sense of despair. Its eyes locked onto mine, conveying a silent, haunting plea. The apparition's icy fingers brushed against my skin, sending a wave of cold through my body. I staggered back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispering voices had become a cacophony of anguished cries, and the walls seemed to close in on me, their surfaces undulating and shifting. Desperate to escape, I fled from the room and raced back down the corridor. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more chaotic. I reached the elevator, but the doors were closed, and I pounded on them in a panic. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to press in on me from all sides. In a final act of desperation, I pressed the call button repeatedly, my heart racing with fear. The elevator doors creaked open, and I threw myself inside, my breath coming in short, frantic bursts. I pressed the button for the ground floor, and the elevator began its descent. As the elevator moved downward, the whispering voices gradually faded, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. When the doors finally opened, I stumbled out into the familiar lobby, the normalcy of the surroundings a stark contrast to the horrors I had just experienced. I looked back at the elevator one last time, the sense of dread still lingering in my mind. I knew I would never take that elevator again, and the haunting whispers and ghostly apparition would remain with me, a chilling reminder of the night I had faced something truly otherworldly.